Welcome back to the city. In the last few episodes, we've grown this place from a tiny seaside port into a castle town with an impressive city centre. But a city isn't just houses and a marketplace, it survives on the back of its industries. So in today's episode, I'm spreading out across the city to build up its industrial heart. Rather than working on one giant project, we're delving into a series of smaller builds to try and add some realistic variety instead of just adding more houses. No messing on today, I'm jumping in with the very first idea that stuck in my head, a blacksmith. Iconic in RPGs and TV, the main character will walk into the big city or the smallest of villages and be faced by a blacksmith making swords, forging armour and everything in between. This isn't that. In reality, armourers and weaponsmiths were highly skilled craftsmen, often working in dedicated guild centres and major cities. I'm not saying that your average village smithy couldn't forge a sword, but their every day would be spent making nails and horseshoes or repairing tools. Mundane perhaps, but an essential role to play. I've put my forge right next to one of the main gates, not just because there was a convenient gap for a building, but because I wanted to attach a large stable building where the owner can best sell his services to travellers and mobile industries, such as traders and people working outside of the walls. Repairing carts, refitting horseshoes, and turning out the unglamorous essentials like nails, hinges and tools. Without this skilled industry, the market we built in the last episode could never function properly. Also, fire in cities made almost exclusively from wood was an ever-present danger. Placing the forge right up against the walls and with adequate spacing between it and the next building seemed to me like a sensible thing to do. I was really happy with all the detail I put into the courtyard, and I even tried making a custom tree as I realised there isn't much greenery in everything I built previously. With that done, my city has its first proper industry. Next, I'm heading outside the city walls to build something a little less obvious than a forge, but is still very much connected. Forging metal requires temperatures much higher than you can achieve by burning just wood, and in medieval Europe coal mining was much less common than in later years. Instead, they burnt wood to make charcoal, which burns much hotter. However, being a charcoal burner was surprisingly lonely work. Burners spent long stretches of time deep in the woods, tending their fires day and night. If a fire burnt too hot, everything was ruined, too cold, and the charcoal wouldn't form. Because of that isolation, a lot of cultures ended up treating charcoal burners poorly. Seen as being separate from the town, despite being essential to its function, charcoal burners were ostracised. Their profession was considered dishonourable, and they were frequently accused of evil practices. Due to the continuing requirement to keep the kiln at the right temperature, and carbon monoxide rising from the kiln, it can be assumed that anxiety, lack of sleep, and loneliness made the burner himself something of an unlucky spectre to an already superstitious town. After that, I moved next door to build an outpost for woodcutting. Another small but essential piece of a city's industrial network. From simple firewood to carts, tools, fences, barrels, and whole houses, for almost every aspect of medieval life, timber was essential. I set up a simple hut and covered storage area for seasoning logs, and right next to that I built a saw pit. These pits were a common way to turn raw logs into planks and beams. With that, my city now has a steady supply of wood and charcoal for fuel and construction. My next idea led me all the way back across the city, to the port we built way back in the first episode. In a spot just outside the walls, I wanted to build a small shipyard, where skilled craftsmen can combine the fresh timber from our newly built forester with solid iron nails from the blacksmith to make ships for trade, fishing, or war. I'm constructing a handful of warehouse buildings around a central area where the ship itself will be constructed. These buildings can be used for storing the multitude of materials needed to build a ship, but also to work on smaller components that can be installed separately. Shipbuilding is something of a jump up from my other industries so far. Very specialised, it requires multiple talents and a lot of combined labour to produce a single craft. Whereas the blacksmith, charcoal burner and woodcutter can all work largely as individuals. Shipbuilding, on the other hand, requires not only skilled carpenters, but caulkers, rope makers, blacksmiths and labourers all on site to produce a single high-cost item. And I think that can be seen from the size of this industry. Shipbuilding in medieval Europe was comparatively simple compared to just a couple of centuries later. The ships of the day, cogs, carvels, hulks and galleys, were simple and utilitarian, mostly consisting of a single central mast and one large square-rigged sail. This provided limited manoeuvrability, but these ships were surprisingly tough considering their fairly simple construction. With that, my first large-scale industry is complete. I think this yard adds a lot of character to the city and starts to contribute to its identity as a hub for trade and craftsmanship. Next up, I decided that I wanted to head back inside the city walls. I took a step away from the traditional side of industry and started working on a large guild hall. I'm actually basing this building on the real-life Merchant Adventurers Hall in York, a building I love, mostly because it's opposite one of our favourite bars. Built in the mid-1300s, York's Merchant Adventurers Hall was built as a centre for charity and for like-minded merchants to gather and discuss their trades. However, in my city, I've imagined this hall as belonging to a carpenter's guild. Given that shipbuilding requires an incredibly specialised skill set, making my city a centre for talented carpenters and joiners seemed like a thematic way to progress. By basing my carpenters guild on one of the UK's largest historical timber-framed buildings and placing it in a commanding location at one end of the central marketplace, I'm hoping this hall will stand as a statement which will speak clearly that carpentry is an organised and respected profession within the city. So this guild hall acts as a kind of keystone for the episode, a place where raw materials from outside the city walls, skilled labour and commercial ambition all meet under one roof, and a sign that this city is growing beyond simple survival into something more structured and powerful. I like how this one turned out, and as it reminds me of York, my favourite city in the UK, I'm glad I recreated it. After wrapping that up, I decided to fill in the gap between the market and my new Carpenters Guild. I wanted to fill this space with houses that could easily accommodate wealthy merchants who choose to live close to the marketplace, or slightly more grand buildings that could be small guild halls or trading houses of their own. As a city's industries expand, you start to see a new kind of resident appear, a wealthy middle class. Merchants, guildmasters, experienced craftsmen, people whose income comes from trade, shipping and manufacturing, rather than tilling the land. The buildings around the merchant district reflect that growing merchant class. They're larger, more solid and more decorated, because they're not just homes, they're places to store goods, keep accounts and host meetings. It's the architecture of a prosperous city. Of course, that prosperity isn't shared by everyone. In a future episode, I'll need to turn my attention to the city's less fortunate residents. Slums, dark alleyways, and cottage industries will fill in many of the gaps that still remain. I'm especially happy with how the house with the square tower turned out. I've gone back to using a gradient wall texture, moving from cobble at the base up into plastered white stone, which I think suits upper class townhouses really well. Finally, I decided to add a bridge section over the road to the right, partially to introduce a bit more variety into the street layout, but also it lets me create a more enclosed area beyond for a future project. Features like bridges, gates, and overhangs are great for breaking up sightlines and make streets feel more interesting and more believable. Beyond the bridge, I started work on a small enclosed square centered around a communal oven. In medieval towns, ovens like this were a shared resource. Most homes didn't have their own oven, partly because of the cost, but also, as I mentioned before, open flames were a constant risk in dense urban areas. Instead, bread would be baked here, often on a rota with households bringing their dough to be cooked and paying a small fee for the use of the oven. I started surrounding the square by building some more townhouses. I want this area to feel less tied to the market and instead more a part of the civilian side to the city. Therefore, the buildings here will be primarily wood and will have fewer floors, and be generally smaller the further I get away from the marketplace. I also wanted to include a few warehouse-style buildings, long-term storage for grains, materials, or goods for exporting down at the dockyard. I wanted these to be smaller, lower buildings, along with a handful of diagonal buildings, which are always a bit of a pain to build. However, they do help break up the uniformity of the city streets and add some much-needed variety to the area. Spaces like this were practical, but they were also social. A square like this could very naturally become a meeting place. Decorating this area, I decided to add benches, tables, and even a couple of stalls to reflect the social side to this space. On the other side of the square I just built, I'm starting another area dedicated to small industry. My idea for this section was a small cottage industry focused on the manufacturing of cloth. This area is much smaller and I wanted it to feel slightly more ignored and worn out than other areas. I spent a while adding lots of plant life, weeds and rubbish around the workshops. The last thing I wanted to do was fill in an awkward open space on the far side of the gate, opposite the blacksmith. I felt like this was the perfect spot for another stable, somewhere travellers could keep their horses or traders could house their livestock while staying in the city. With that, the last of the buildings are in place. Individually, none of these projects are especially grand, except for perhaps the Guildhall. However, together they start to change how the city feels, giving it an identity more than just a place for people to live. So before we end, let's take a step back and see how this all fits together. Well, it's been another 5 months since I uploaded my last video, and 9 long months since my last update on my medieval city. So if you've stuck around and watched this video, thank you so much. If you're new here, I hope you enjoyed the journey, enough to wait another half a year for the next video. I think this project is really starting to take shape, and I feel like I'm still learning a lot about both building in Minecraft and turning that into content. So I hope you stick around for the next one.